Welcome to the Region Free Gamers podcast, and on this episode, we talk about bionic arms, jetpacks, and what the hell is a dragon's dogma? Welcome back everyone to another episode of the Region Free Gamers podcast, the podcast that does not need to speak Esperanto because we are fluent in gaming. My name is Ozzy Garcia, and I will be your host for this episode, which is all about Capcom in the 7th generation of consoles, which, for those of you that do not have your generations memorized, is the PS3 and Xbox 360 generation. But before we get into that, I want to remind you all that if you like what you hear from us, then make sure to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and maybe even subscribe. We know you're bombarded every day with people telling you to like and subscribe, but it really does make a huge difference for us. Having said that, let me introduce you to our virtual roundtable for this episode. In the Netherlands, we have Geoff, don't talk to me about Brexit, Ivets.
Hey, what's up, guys?
In Rhode Island, we have Arnaldo Green Fandango Perez.
I have been obsessively Googling real-life jetpacks for like 2 days now.
How is this not a thing? You know, we'll get into that, but how are jetpack, how is jetpack competitive sport not a thing? We need to get on this. And to round out this panel, we have a very exciting guest. He's a game designer by trade, a lover of Django Reinhardt, and according to Paul, my spirit animal. So it's Robert Howard, host of the Grid Snaps podcast. Rob, thanks for joining us, man.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Big fan of the show.
Oh, yes. I mean, just to give a little bit of background, actually, Rob reached out to us, because he was actually a listener. So, we listened to his podcast, really liked it, thought that he could bring in a very good and fresh voice to the podcast, and so here we are. So thanks a lot for joining us, man.
Oh, you're very welcome. Hopefully the cold meds won't interfere with my ability to deliver good content. So
if you're not medicated while podcasting, you're doing it wrong.
You have very good baritone, so you should be good to go, Rob. So Rob, let's learn a little bit more about you. First of all, I want to ask you, how did you find a bootleg version, essentially, of Castlevania's beginning music for your podcast?
Well, I gotta say, if you're talking about the Super Nintendo episode, I think is where I had that. That was a few episodes back. I have a very unscientific way of finding podcast music. I just go to YouTube and kind of just shamelessly rip stuff off of YouTube. So I found that somewhere. I think I did credit the person, at least in my notes on Podbean or whatever. But yeah, that's how I found that. It was just a nice random find. Nice.
So Rob, let's learn a little bit more about you. What was your first console?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first console I ever actually played was the Atari 2600, which was sort of a generation behind me. I'm 39, so the 2600 would have been already 5, 6, 7 years old by the time I first saw it. But I went to a neighbor's house and played it, and it's difficult to understand what it felt like playing games back then because there was this notion of you were controlling the TV. I don't think people have that anymore now when they play games, but that's what I remember thinking, that I'm controlling it on the TV. That's me, right? But my first real console that I had in my house was a NES. I was that kid in the Zelda commercial that Nintendo put out in the 80s. I asked for Zelda. I got it with the, I think it was the control deck, the Duck Hunt, the Duck Hunt combination Mario Brothers version of the Nintendo, and I sort of spent my life as a Nintendo partisan until the mid 1990s, when they got me really mad with the lack of games on the N64, and then I traded my console for my sister's PlayStation, but I'm still very much a Nintendo fan despite that. So
yeah, I think that's a very common experience. Certainly, that's the experience that we've had for many of the guests that we've had in our podcast, that they were, Nintendo fanboys, and then little by little, they got pissed off by Nintendo's decision. Eventually, they saw the light and went to PlayStation. But I don't want to show my colors too soon. But that's really good to hear that you're kind of smack dab in the middle of that generation that just grew up with Nintendo, where Nintendo really had a huge push like back in 1986, 1987, and all the kids wanted that Nintendo. I imagine that you also saw The Wizard in theaters.
Oh, of course, absolutely, yeah. And as a parent now, I totally get it. What my parents must have been feeling like back then. This notion of this is a commercial. This is advertising, right? I feel this about YouTubers now that my kids watch, and it's the same thing, really. But of course, that was like there was no internet or any way to find out about these things. So The Wizard is in Nintendo Power, really what you had to figure out what new games were coming out. And so I was just desperate to see that. And then, of course, I remember seeing it, and then there's kind of a letdown that happens then. It's like, okay, that was it? That... So...
If you're not into Fred Savage, then you're going to be in for some disappointment. So let me ask you, were you one of those obnoxious playground kids that hated on Sonic and thought Sonic was lame just because you were pro Nintendo?
People that know me well, they'll say, and this was true with me then as a little kid and true of me now, I'm a nice guy, disease sufferer, possibly even to my detriment on occasion. So I was probably never that person. I was definitely a Nintendo partisan. It definitely was never in my head to ever ask for a Sega console, although part of it was this sort of Oliver Twist thing, where to ask my parents for another game console just seemed so utterly beyond the pale, like asking for more soup. So it never occurred to me that I could possibly have more than one console, right? And of course now as an adult I have most of them. So,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I remember for me, it took about 6 months of slow build-up of mentioning it. Oh, look, it's in this catalogue. Oh, look, it's here. Really slow build-up to ask for a new console like that. Absolutely, I'm the same. My parents would have gone, "Are you crazy? Are you crazy? You got the SNES? Get out of our face." That's right. That's what I would have got.
And to parents, consoles are just consoles. There's no distinction between them. It's just like everything is a Nintendo. Why would you need another Nintendo? That's like saying, I want two cars of the same brand.
Yeah, to me, I remember because my parents divorced when I was really young.
And so you played them against each other.
Pretty much. Like it really was a situation where I distinctly remember like my dad got me an N64 for Christmas, and then shortly thereafter my mom bought me a PlayStation 1 for some reason. But it was like never the twain shall meet. Like when I was at my dad's house, like it's Nintendo 64 time. When I was with my mom, it's like PlayStation time.
Yeah.
And then I distinctly remember in the PS2 era, I wanted to buy an Xbox because I had played Knights of the Old Republic, and I was like, I need to own this.
Right.
Like, this is not a question. Like, I need to own it. And then I bought a used one. Like, I had to trade in some stuff to GameStop, I think, and I bought a used one. And having both of those consoles in my room at the same time, I don't think I've ever been so overwhelmed. I was just like, I can play anything now.
I can just imagine little Arnie going to his dad and saying, "If you love me like Mom does, you would buy me an Xbox."
What an evil child! What an evil child!
Speaking of parents, and I have a funny anecdote, from my college days. So I went. From about 1999 to 2001 or so, it was kind of like the period of my life where I gamed the least. I think I did a little bit of like emulation, and it's because I was in college for music, and I was just heads down into that at that time. And my parents actually worried that I wasn't having enough fun in college, which is a weird thing to worry about. Totally weird. And so to remedy this, they bought me a PS2 for Christmas, like I think my junior year of college, I think it was. And I was instantly back in it. I remember picking up Metal Gear Solid 2. I didn't care about the writing thing; that didn't bother me at all. And I was back into gaming and I've never stopped since. So I guess I can thank them for that.
I mean, we've said it over and over again. I mean, I think all of us gamers at some point in our lives we kind of lapse from gaming, and then we rediscover it. But it's good to see that, and interesting to see that it was your parents that made you rediscover it. It's like, okay, maybe you should be back into gaming. The reason why I asked you about Sonic is because as we speak now, the Sonic movie just came out, and I was wondering if you had seen it with your daughter. Do you have a daughter?
I have two. I have two daughters, and I have not seen it yet. Neither one of them have expressed. And this kind of makes me sad. Much interest. Gaming for them, I would say I have a daughter that's 12 and a half, and has definitely hit the teenage thing now, hardcore. She really likes Danganronpa, I think if I'm saying that right, which is...
Oh, wow.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I try to keep tabs of what she's into, and it's kind of like right on the edge of like what I find comfortable... No, because it's almost, I read it, it's almost like it's Saw, but in high school. Like when I read it for the premise of it or whatever. But she's like her mom. She likes horror stuff. Like, my wife really loves all like horror movies, and I don't because I'm a little chicken. Right. My 5-year-old's going to be 6 soon. She doesn't play a lot of games yet, but she really is fascinated with Bendy simply because YouTubers that she watches are into Bendy. And so I'll see like bendy drawings that she'll make, but no, neither one of them have expressed a lot of interest in Sonic, which is kind of sad. But
well, that's why you had to push it on them, Rob.
That's right.
This is the whole point of parenting.
Well,
it's just to make experiments of your kids.
That's right.
That is an interesting point, though, because we've had a few people on the podcast who do have children, and it's always, I don't, and so I'm always curious as to like. How much do you push them to try to start gaming, if at all, or do you just let them sort of pick it up on their own eventually?
I know what my answer will be, Arnie.
I'm imagining sort of like a Clockwork Orange
That's
situation.
That's exactly what I was picturing right now.
Hold their eyes open.
You will play Mario.
My oldest daughter did. We had an amazing experience with Earthbound, actually. We played it together, the entire game. And this was probably when she was, I guess, 8 or so, 9 maybe. And it was awesome because I would go to work and she would just play, during the summer when she wasn't in school. And she just would play the same battles over and over and over again. And so I'd get home and the party was so OP from her just fighting again and again, that repetition. But we had an amazing time. That game just seemed to really... hit with her, and it's no surprise then that one of the games that she did really like later on was Undertale, I think for kind of similar reasons. Just the themes of it, the way it's sort of about regular kids, I guess, just appealed to her a lot, because I would try to introduce, like, hey, if you like Earthbound, check out Final Fantasy VI. This is just going to blow your mind. and no, not really. It didn't catch. So Earthbound was special.
It seems like a very appropriate game to play with your daughter. There is the whole theme of parenting in that series. So I'm glad that you had that in common and that you have that game to serve as a linchpin of your relationship with her. That's pretty awesome, man. Rob, tell us a little bit more about your background in game design.
Right, so basically what happened with me is, because I already mentioned my undergrad was in music performance, which seems quite distant from gaming, although you'd be surprised. There's a lot of us musicians that are in gaming. I think what ended up happening was I was in grad school, like my first attempt at grad school for like jazz studies, and of course halfway through I realized that there was just no reasonable career path that I had, other than maybe being a college professor, which is what I am now, ironically. But it was just a different. It just didn't seem like it was going anywhere, and I was really into Knights of the Old Republic, that's been mentioned earlier in the show, and I thought, wow, like I'm pretty decent with computers. I was always a tinkerer. I always went to computer camps as a kid, and would tinker around with BASIC and stuff like that, and so it just made sense to at first try to pursue like game audio, and I did that, and kind of through the process of doing that, I got a little bit of really low level paid work, like just super indie stuff, and through doing that I was like, I really like this, but I'm already like past my mid-20s here, like I should pursue this more seriously, and I should find a way to do it like now, fast, and so it made sense for me then to go the Southern Methodist University in Dallas that had a graduate program for game design. So, my bachelor's degree wasn't a total waste then. So I felt good about that. And so I went into that program, and just threw caution to the wind, all the student debt, and my first child was already born. In fact, she was just 2 months old when I did this, and so it's just a heck of a thing for my wife to put up with, and I'm always eternally grateful for her amazing support when I just uprooted us from rural Ohio and just decided to pursue this thing. And I did that, and of course had a blast in school, and then went out in the worst economy we've had in like 30 years. It was like 2008, 2009 was when I was entering the job force. So it was really bleak. I mean, I remember going to GDC that year, and like the career pavilion had like half the companies that it would normally have, and it was just not a great scene. It's kind of funny that we're talking about these Capcom games, because that was all the stuff that was coming out, at that time.
Yeah.
But I ended up getting a job at a developer named Vicious Cycle Software in Raleigh, North Carolina. I don't know if you guys ever heard of them. They've been out of business now for a number of years. But they were just finishing up Eat Lead: The Return of Matt Hazard when I joined.
Oh, yes, I remember
I know
that.
Eat Lead, yeah.
Interesting game, flawed but interesting. And so after I joined, or actually my job interview, this is just one of those kind of amazing things that happen in a career. One of the games that kind of cemented me as a potential game designer was the Earth Defense Force series. I love Earth Defense Force. I remember buying it, from, I think, used from Blockbuster or something, and playing it before my first daughter was born. And then when she was born, I would just sit her there in my lap and keep playing it, But, this is a Japanese game series. It's still a Japanese game series. How in the heck would I ever work on an Earth Defense Force? So I show up for my job interview, and they're like, okay, here's the secret game we're making. And I see the Earth Defense Force 2017 box, there on the little chair. And I'm like, what is going on? What is this? And then I realized the game I'm going to work on at Vicious Cycle is the American EDF. And it was because Vicious Cycle was owned by a company that's still around called D3. D3 owns that IP. And they wanted an American developer to take a stab at it. And so I got to make probably the only American Earth Defense Force that will ever get made. And it was absolute blast to make that. I tell other developers that, if I ran the universe, every game developer would have to make an EDF game, because they should.
Cut their teeth, essentially.
Yeah, they're so much fun to make, because there's so much. There's no fat in these games. It's all action. There's no frills, just straight ahead. It wasn't we didn't do a perfect job at it or anything, but I thought it turned out pretty good. And then from there, it was really just a matter of I moved on, because that's kind of, unfortunately, one of the realities of game development is the easiest way to progress is to jump from job to job as opposed to getting promoted in the same place. And so I went to Human Head Studios. Recently changed their name to Roundhouse Studios. ZeniMax bought them. I went there to work on Prey 2, which was a famous canceled project. Amazing project. I mean, I can't say enough how cool it was. But sometimes in life, kind of things that don't go well, end up serving you well in some other way. After that whole disaster, we were all shipped to Boston to work on BioShock Infinite to help out. And sometimes in game dev, you help out on other projects, and it's kind of, you're doing really menial stuff. I mean, you're just kind of shoving crates around. You're doing the garbage they don't want to do, basically. But that really wasn't the case. I mean, we were living in Boston, working in those offices, making the game with them. It was true co-development. So that was really special. And that opportunity really opened up doors for me, because it puts that type of game on your resume, which is really, really important, as it turns out, to have one of those. And, not to go on and on and on and on, I ended up in California for a while, working for a place called Cold Iron Studios. They're still developing their game, their Aliens game, which I'm sure is going great. And then I ended up where I'm at now, at Purdue University, teaching game design and level design there. And it's been a blast so far. I started in August, and it's been going great. Students have been great. I think it's been good, for my family to settle here. I find that, I'll just say real quickly that, most of us, when we hit the 10-year mark, which is where I hit last year, you start to think about, what am I going to be doing for the rest of my life here? Because when you start in the game industry, you don't care. I mean, getting coffee for people, sweeping the floors, you just want to get into the game industry. It doesn't matter what the pay is. It's kind of almost like a dangerous mindset, right? But once you've been doing it for a while, you're like, okay, what now? Like, where do I see myself long term? And I realized I wanted to mentor people. I wanted to educate and mentor, and you could do that as like a lead level designer or a creative director, but there's only so many of those jobs to go around. I had the master's degree, which kind of unlocks the door at university. So the Purdue thing opened up, and I figured this is a good chance for me to do some of that stuff.
Good to hear, man.
Awesome.
Good to hear. Let me ask you something. What does your curriculum look like for your students?
Well, what's really fun about that is, Purdue is I say relatively new program. It's actually been around, I think, for 9 years, but it is, I would still say a program very much in development. And that's exciting because what that means is when I join them, I'm not taking over some other level designer's classes or something. The classes come directly from me. I am the curriculum. Like, I sit down and I write out these PowerPoints and these presentations, and it is all coming out of my head, hopefully well researched, hopefully informed, right? But they really do allow me a lot of freedom and trust there to develop. And so, at least for my classes, for the most part, it is really me drawing from a combination of what I was taught at SMU. So going through a master's program does help because I teach undergraduates here, but I have like a basis. Someone taught me, so I can go by what they taught me and have some kind of template. But then it's the experiences I had in the industry that's informed this. And then, hopefully lots and lots of new learnings that I'm always trying to do now to keep things as current as possible. But I would say, in general, what we try to do at Purdue is we form a structure that gets you in teams, because game development is really teamwork. It's something that people may not know, because there might be some notion of the lone auteur, controlling everything. But really, it is a team production. Even indie developers, it's often a team production. So we get them in teams right away, because I think that's one of the big advantages of going to college. You can learn all the stuff, outside of school. I mean, the resources out there are amazing, but what's hard to emulate as kind of a lone wolf is working with other people and dealing with all that squishy soft skill stuff that happens when you have to work with other human beings. And so I think we really try to structure our program around that, and then it's kind of trying to balance the team games with giving the students the opportunity to work on kind of individual projects that will really shine on their portfolios. So kind of balancing those two things.
Fascinating, man. I mean, and how big are your classes?
Well, my biggest class is probably the class right now that we funnel sophomores into, because it is that team thing, getting them introduced into teams. And I think it's like 70, 80 students, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
And my individual classes, they can range. I'm teaching a game audio course now that just has 7 or 8 people. It's a brand new course. It's in one of our smallest rooms, so it's more like they're like fireside chats when I teach that one. My game scripting coding class has about 18 people. That's pretty good size. My first class had my first level design course had about 30. So you can see it's kind of all over the map in terms of class size.
Nice. I guess let me throw you a question out of left field here.
Okay.
Do you ever see yourself developing a game again?
I sure hope so. I think that there's a interesting responsibility I have, not to sound too, pompous, but to the taxpayers of Indiana. I always try to remember this because I do think it's important that, I have to keep myself sharp. And right now I'm in this zone where, it's been less than a year, since I took this job. So right now I'm fresh, right? But by the time I get into, I don't know, year 3 or something, then, who knows how big the gap is between my assumptions and what's actually going on. Now, the person that runs this whole program here at Purdue, he actually spent the summer working as a programmer for Volition, which I thought was awesome. And I definitely want to pursue things like that in the summer, since we do get the summers off. It doesn't always have to be structured that way. Maybe it could be more of a consultant thing or whatever. So I do want to have relations with the industry in that fashion, because I think it's just good for everybody. But as far as just even development, I end up developing a lot of things for my classes too, like my game scripting course. Basically, I made them like a very bare bones tiny RPG. It just has like one enemy in it, and it just has like an attack and a defend that doesn't work, which is on purpose because they're supposed to make it work. And so, I spend a lot of time in the technology making things, to kind of support the courses. So in that sense, it doesn't really feel that different from what I was doing before.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's round that out with one final question. What's your favorite game of all time?
Yeah. So a few years ago, I would have said Resident Evil 4, but that has been displaced by Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain.
Really?
Yeah.
You're the first one that we ever have on the show with that opinion. I am very, very curious, morbidly curious about this.
Right.
You're going to have to give us an explanation for that. So,
all right.
go.
Absolutely. So, okay. What I love about that game so much is, like, is this. So, when you play, kind of an open world game like that, what I think where it really shines is how it gives you the potential to have all the tools you need to approach every situation the way you would like to approach it. And so in that sense, it does this thing that I like to refer to as service to the player, where the players kind of put front and center. When you play older Metal Gear games, it's like, okay, if you need a rocket launcher, if you need the sniper rifle, you probably have to search for it in the environment somewhere. On-site procurement's even baked into the story. But here, you have this ability to, call in airdrops. There are restrictions. It's not just a complete cheat. You could run out of resources. You have to actually physically go to the location it's dropped and so on. But it just gives you this incredible freedom to approach situations in any number of different ways. And the way the level design works, the way the enemy installations are designed, thinking about things like the airport in South Africa and a lot of the locations in Afghanistan as well, they really invite that approach. And so for me, playing a stealth game, it takes away a lot of, what it is? It actually then emulates another favorite game of mine, which is Batman Arkham Asylum, and that you're now a hunter now. Like in previous Metal Gears, it's like you are the prey. You're sort of being hunted by everything, and you have to kind of be very careful and work around them. Mm-hmm. In Phantom Pain, you really have more of a sense of hunting them, which I really like. I really like how amazing the game controls. I like to compare it to the last couple of Uncharted games, where as good as those games are, I feel like they've become so cinematic that you press a button, you tilt the stick forward. There's so many transitional animations and things to make Nathan Drake look good that you don't get that one-to-one, I want the character to do something happens immediately. But that Fox engine, man, is just so snappy with the controls. Now, we know from Metal Gear Survive that can be ruined. Right?
Exactly.
But like at least under the directorship of Kojima, the Fox engine was just amazing technically. And look, I mean, beyond some of the design points, I mean, am I a sucker for that kind of 1980s gung-ho G.I. Joe storytelling? Absolutely. I stuff like some of the over-the-top dialogue that occurs in that game is just so enjoyable to me. So it kind of hit a lot of sweet spots, and it kind of consumed my life from... I bought it and let it sit on my shelf for a while, so it wasn't until like the summer of 2016 that I started playing it. But that summer was like the only game I played, and it was the only game I played well into the fall. And it kind of turned me from I kind of like that fellow Kojima's games to like... a super fan dork, one of those annoying stands as they call them now, right?
Well, that's a pretty good pitch for Metal Gear Solid 5. I still hold that it's not a Metal Gear Solid game, but I think that you've made a very good case for it. So I may have to revisit it.
I had a quick question for you, Rob, if I could.
Sure.
Is there, like, in your courses, is there a level, a specific level, a stage, a world in a game that you sort of point to or use as an example of like, this is peak level design for me. Like, this is what I think, stands out to me as a good level.
Right. No, that's a great question. And, right off the top of my head, I can think of, since we were just talking about the Phantom Pain, I'll point out, I think it's called the Nova Braga Airport, I believe. I think I even podcasted about it on my own show. And it's interesting to talk about because, when you have an open world game, it's like, do you even think of it as a level? I kind of do, because it's a specific play space that's been constructed, and what I like about it so much, and what I would point out to my classes is, I try to view level design very, and this is one of those buzzwords I hate, but I'll use it holistically, right? And what I mean by that is, okay, like, what is the purpose of level design? So, in my view, it's this. You have a game design that's the engine for everything. And what good level design does is it makes that game design more effective. It enhances it, right? So when you look at something like the Nova Braga Airport, it's like, okay, what is the game design that we're trying to support here? Well, it's like I said, it's this. You have all your tools available. You always have some form of a sniper rifle, silenced pistol, assault weapon available. Yes, you can develop better ones and so on, but you basically have everything available. So you have to design spaces that can accommodate various different approaches, and that layout of that airport does, because you have, you have various different entry points in the walls that take advantage of some of the climbing mechanics. You have kind of close quarter areas inside the various buildings where those weapons and techniques come into play, but you also have vast expanses on the airstrip where the sniper rifles and so on can be used. And so, again, it was clearly designed, whoever made that. And by the way, as an aside, I absolutely love how when you play a mission in that game, it actually will give the level designer credit. It'll say, a Hideo Kojima game in production, like sort of everyone likes to make fun of that. But then right after that, it'll be level designed by this person. Oh, I love that so much. But anyway, so I would point out the way that a level like that enhances the underlying game mechanics, because even when we talk about these Capcom games later, I mean, I have fairly strong opinions about how some of those games do that after having played them, because that's really the purpose of level design. It's one of those disciplines that doesn't really stand on its own. You have to have a game design underneath, because that's what the level design's doing. It's making all of that better.
Awesome. Awesome to hear. Well, with that, let us take a break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about those Capcom games which we still haven't talked about and we still haven't mentioned which these are, but just stay tuned and we'll be back. And we're back, and now that we have gotten to know Rob a little bit more, let's jump into the topic for this episode. Capcom, a company we all love. They have given us Mega Man, Resident Evil, Devil May Cry, and who could forget Street Fighter? Certainly not Paul. They have one of the deepest catalogs of any game company outside of Nintendo, and around the time of the PlayStation 1 and 2, Capcom was really at the top of its game. They had established a Resident Evil franchise, along with new franchises like Devil May Cry. And near the end of the 6th generation, they gave us Resident Evil 4, which was Rob's favorite game for a long time, Okami, and also God Hand. So it was a good time for Capcom. But then something happened in the jump to the HD generation. Like many other Japanese companies, Capcom struggled to adapt to the HD generation of consoles, which arguably led to a little bit of a loss of their identity. And this was the case across the entire Japanese industry, so it's not like it was only Capcom that was dealing with this. But it also led people like Keiji Inafune, who was then at Capcom, to say in 2010 that Japanese developers were at least 5 years behind Western developers. Whether that was true or not, it's not clear, but at the same time, clearly things were not going smoothly for Japanese developers. And Inafune himself had a significant hand in steering this generation for Capcom. And a lot of the products from this period from Capcom are a reflection of a policy of looking outwards rather than inwards. So looking for other developers, non-Japanese developers, to basically take the reins of Capcom franchises. And because of that, we saw a lot of third-party developers taking the reins. And the decision, for the most part, we can now in hindsight say that it was a mistake, because it led to poorly received games that failed to live up to Capcom's legacy. And that's why we're calling it Capcom's Lost Generation, because even though there were successes such as Street Fighter 4 and Dead Rising, there were many games that unfortunately fell through the cracks. And although Capcom is doing very well for itself nowadays, not surprisingly because they're actually developing games in-house again, we thought it was worth it to look back on some of the Capcom releases of this generation that we may have forgotten about. And so for this episode, we're going to be taking a look at 3 games in particular so as to keep it tight, and that will be Bionic Commando 2009, Dark Void, and finally Dragon's Dogma. So we're going to start with Bionic Commando 2009. This was a game that was released back in May of 2009 for the PS3 and the Xbox 360, and it was a reboot of the Bionic Commando series that was a hit on the NES. And the original Bionic Commando, if you recall, was released in 1988 for the NES. And the whole conceit of Bionic Commando is that you are a bionic soldier with a grappling hook for an arm that can swing from ledge to ledge with such grappling hook. So instead of jumping, you grapple. And basically that's how you go from platform to platform, basically shooting down bad guys. And so to reboot the series into the HD generation, Capcom decided to hand over development duties to a Swedish developer with a proprietary engine called the Diesel engine, and this developer was Grin. And Grin is a very interesting studio. They're no longer around, but their first release game was a futuristic racing game called Ballistics. So one of the interesting things about that is that Ballistics actually had an arcade version that has one of the coolest arcade designs that I have ever seen. It's reclined, and the 2003 version actually has like force feedback, and it makes you really feel like you're in a futuristic pod. Have any of you guys seen pictures of this arcade machine?
No, I haven't.
No, I haven't. It kind of, the way you're explaining it, it makes me think of that F-Zero GX arcade machine.
It kind of looks
where,
like that.
You sit in the bucket seat and it like sort of moves back and forth.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but I'm pretty sure that there are probably very few of those arcade machines left. But I would be fascinated if, I could actually see one of those in the flesh. But beyond that, Grin worked on PC versions of Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter. That was one of the early 7th generation titles that came over for the Xbox 360 and also PC. But it was also, unfortunately, a very troubled studio. Grin is famously known because they were developing a spin-off of the Final Fantasy series, and this spin-off was called Fortress. And famously, Square Enix did not pay Grin for their work. They were very unhappy with how the game was being developed, with how it was looking. It was more focused on Norse mythology and took a lot of aesthetic design cues from Norse mythology, and I don't think that Square really liked this very much. So this really put a huge strain on Grin, and eventually it led to their bankruptcy because, as we will see, the games that they eventually ended up releasing, like Bionic Commando and Wanted, Weapons of Fate, did not do well at all, and so they were forced to shut down. So I know that, Rob, you've been playing Bionic Commando for a while when we originally started talking about this episode. What were your initial thoughts about this game?
So, yeah, when it came out originally, it was one of those things where you see the dude on the cover with the dreads and you're like, this is just that sort of hardcore marketing that just kind of rubs you the wrong way, and I just ignored it. Okay, I did play Rearmed, I think, when it came out, and I liked that because I loved Bionic Commando as a kid, and the Game Boy Color one was really good. But playing it recently, I realized it was a mistake to not check it out. I actually found it refreshing because it sort of reflects, I think, some of the better aspects of games back then, action games back then. It's sort of no nonsense. It's not trying to give me a bunch of games as service, sort of pablum, kind of monetization tricks and so forth that is get me to each cool action area, find a good reason to propel me to the next one, and give me that cool experience. I rather enjoyed it, my time with the game.
Well, that's good to hear. So Arnie and Geoff, did you all play this game?
I played it for a few hours. I found myself reluctantly enjoying it.
Yeah.
I was terrible at the swinging. And, I figured it out, obviously, but it never felt like as good as other games I've played. And obviously that's not fair, because when I think of swinging now, I think of like PS4 Spider-Man or even like Spider-Man 2, back in the day. So this just didn't feel that fun to swing around. Swinging around just felt like, okay, I have to swing now to get to the other thing that I really want to be doing, which is like shooting and fighting and all that stuff. But overall, I found myself continuing to play. Like, I never got to the point where I was like, I just can't play this anymore. I was always like, I could do a little more of this and play it for a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. So yeah, overall, like, I could see myself finishing it, but I don't think it's a game that I would willingly ever go back to or anything like that.
Yeah, it does feel like a game that had a lot of missed opportunities, and that it has a lot of good parts within it that could be polished to a better state, but that they are still dragged down by the many flaws. One of the things that actually surprised me, and perhaps one of the reasons why you think that the swinging is not as enjoyable, is that the momentum for the swinging just kind of stops once you hit the apex, which is kind of weird. There's not that sense of free-flowing movement, so the physics engine is actually a little bit odd. But it's, the swinging is kind of front and center for the game. This is the main conceit of the game and the main tool for you to enjoy. I mean, it's clearly what was worked on the most, with respect to the game. But I do think that a lot of people compared the game to Spider-Man 2. I think that people wanted kind of the same degree of mobility, because if you're going to be swinging around, then that's what you're going to be looking for in a way. But Geoff, did you see some gameplay of this game or play it at all?
Yes, so I didn't play it, and that's going to be like a common theme with these games. So they came out during, like, we've already mentioned it a couple of times, they came out during my lapse in gaming and where I was struggling to get the motivation to play a lot of the games. I found in this era, a lot of the games I felt looked the same. They were all trying to copy each other. Everything was a shooter, and I was like, I very quickly dismissed games without really ever putting much thought into it. So that's the kind of the state of where I was back in 2009, 2010. I think I stuck to Uncharted 2, and then everything else paled in comparison. Maybe, I'm not sure. But having watched the videos of this, it does seem like a pretty decent game. I know what you're saying, like maybe the movement, the freedom of the movement may be a bit off, because he can jump and grapple, and you couldn't do that in the original Bionic Commando. Yeah. So there's a couple of things that were off, but and I think who does the voice? The guy from Alice in Chains.
Mike Patton.
Yeah. Faith No More. Sorry. But yeah, so I could see because I think he was also in, was it Darkness?
Yes, in the Darkness. He voiced the Darkness.
Yeah. So I could see in that era they were really trying to make games cool, but it doesn't look like, to me, it landed quite well with the characterization and with the narrative. But as you say, maybe the gameplay is what pulls it through.
Yeah, and the thing is, with this game, it's very interesting to see two diverging paths that Capcom took with it. So they basically gave Grin, the opportunity to create a smaller 2D version that was more of a spiritual successor to the original Bionic Commando, and that was Bionic Commando Rearmed. And then there was this full-fat 3D version that was basically Grin's vision of what a modern Bionic Commando should be. And it's not surprising that Rearmed ended up being the more popular one of the two, because I think it hewed closer to the original tone of the game. It carried over the 2D style. It just felt like it was actually Bionic Commando as opposed to this kind of poseur that was being sold as Bionic Commando. So, did any of you guys, Rob, you mentioned that you played Bionic Commando Rearmed. What was your impression of that game?
Well, that one I played when it came out, so it's a little bit hazed, from the kind of mists of time or whatever. But, I remember I kind of had the same reaction that I have a lot of times to 2.5D. I remember it was that kind of 3D but 2D presentation where it just... I always feel like the physics of those games always leaves me wanting a little bit versus the 2D, the proper 2D sprites or whatever. So I enjoyed it, but it made me want to honestly go back to the Game Boy Color, especially, which I still think might be the best Bionic Commando, maybe.
Absolutely. Done. I mean, it's really, there's a feel of sluggishness in 2.5D games that I don't think can be overcome. That's why, even in the best of cases, something like Bloodstained, I was still disappointed that they did not go with sprites.
Right.
I know Geoff agrees with me.
Wholeheartedly, yep.
And you mentioned the Bionic Commando for the Game Boy Color. That game is actually one of the best showcases for the Game Boy Color. One of the best looking games on that system, actually. So if any of you guys are interested in that, you should definitely pick it up. It's not very expensive at all. But Arnie, did you play Rearmed, and what do you think of it?
I didn't play Rearmed. I'll be honest, like, Bionic Commando has never truly appealed to me, even in its NES form, like, even in its 2D form. I haven't played the Game Boy Color one, so maybe I should take a look at that one. But, I don't know, there's never been, like, no aspect of Bionic Commando has ever made me be like, I need to play that right now. But I could see the appeal of it in 2D or even 2.5D as opposed to 3D in terms of making the swinging a lot more simplistic and easy to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, and in terms of going over to the 3D version, it really redesigned the original game in many ways. It really felt like the greedy reboot that no asked for. And so it had shades of Bomberman Act Zero, and I think in many ways the game was never able to shake off that, I don't know, impression in a way. And it brings back Nathan Spencer, and it is a continuation of the original game, except now he has been in jail for 5 years. He has grown dreadlocks because that's what you naturally do when you're in jail for 5 years. And he is a disgraced Bionic operative because apparently everyone has turned against Bionic soldiers.
Yeah. Well, he did blow up Hitler's head, so
I mean, I would say that's arguably a good thing. At the very beginning, he actually doesn't have his bionic arm, so it's very interesting to see, essentially an amputee kind of running around, in the beginning of the game, and until he's reunited with his beloved bionic arm. And there's a reason why I call it beloved, which we will touch upon later on. And so at the beginning, you kind of just play with this character who is just, running and shooting like any other game around the time that was being released. But eventually, of course, you do get reunited with your arm, and that's when the swinging mechanics come into play. So what was your impression, Rob, of the swinging mechanics? Did you find yourself enjoying them, or did you feel like something didn't click for you, like with Arnie?
So I have to say, one of you pointed out the momentum thing, and that's one of those interesting things about a game mechanic that as I was playing, something was always kind of frustrating me a little bit, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And then when you articulated, yes, that's what it is, because you're always being forced to kind of, you have to kind of hit the right spot in the swing in order to propel yourself, enough of a distance to make it to the next thing. That's kind of a thing you have to do constantly in the game, and it was probably the most frustrating part of the swinging mechanics. But what I will say, though, what I think they did a good job, and this is my own bias as I think a level designer and looking at it from that lens, is that like the levels I think do a good job of exploiting that mechanic, regardless of whether the mechanic itself has an issue. The levels are very vertical. Like even when you go inside of places, they tend to have very tall ceilings, and it does kind of lead to these interesting combat scenarios where you see some soldiers on a ledge somewhere and you kind of have your choice as to kind of how to swing towards them and how to approach the situation. So I actually quite enjoyed that, almost to the point where I didn't quite notice that problem with the swing. But now I realize, oh yeah, sure, that was an issue.
Yeah, I mean, and there's also another thing about this game is that it takes place in a blown up environment, and so it's also littered with radiation. So you would expect an open world, that utilizes those swinging mechanics, but it's actually quite linear in nature, because every time that you kind of go astray from your predetermined path, you get hit with radiation and you die almost instantaneously. So it's a very good way of pigeonholing you into the particular level design that the Grin wanted you to go through. And I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons why this game did not do well, which is that people were expecting an open world game. And so with respect to that, Rob, I mean, do you find that even without that lack of open world, do you feel like the game design, the level design was still tight enough that it didn't really hurt the game at all?
Well, I actually did feel that way, that it did overcome that. Now, you brought up Spider-Man 2, and I think that's a really fascinating thing to consider that I hadn't thought about when I played the game, because, when I played it, totally out of perspective in 2020, looking back, it's like, I know what I'm getting into in some respect. I'm expecting something linear, and so I'm just not like, yeah, and by the way, the radiation thing did kind of drive me nuts a little bit because you die so quickly, right? I was just like, what is going on here? But I'm like, well, it's of its time, and then you kind of then put those blinders on, and you're looking at the moment to moment and accepting it. But if you were a gamer back then, you would have been absolutely influenced by Spider-Man 2, and even some of the open world games that had already been out, and definitely would have been looking at it from that lens. I think it probably negatively impacted the game. That and I would say the grimdark marketing probably were the two main downfalls of it, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and also from a technical point of view, I mean, the game, not just a technical point of view, but an aesthetic point of view, the game just looks very brown and gray, which is kind of the de facto look of that generation around that time. And, I think a lot of design decisions were made that were probably not good in hindsight. And, you can't really blame Grin too much because this was just kind of the flavor of the day at the time.
Right.
But at the same time, when you're talking about something like Bionic Commando, there's an inherent campiness to the concept. It's kind of comic book in nature. You have this super soldier, kind of like G.I. Joe, swinging from ledge to ledge, taking down bad guys. And so when you adapt that to a kind of post-apocalyptic scenario in which you're just this pissed off grunt, wielding guy, it just kind of rubs you the wrong way, and it just kind of loses the spirit of Bionic Commando a little bit. And I think that's probably why Rearn was probably better received than the reboot, because you had some of the character, even if it wasn't all of it and it wasn't quite the original Bionic Commando, you had some of the character of the original game within it. But with this game, you're kind of facing a dilapidated city all the time, and it's all crumbling buildings and grays and stuff like that. Eventually you do make it into a jungle and the like, but it still feels like the game just needs a lot more thematic variety than it necessarily provides. I don't know, do any of you guys feel the same way?
I agree. I think, like you said, it's especially because so early on, it's just the city. It's just brown, gray, rubble, lots of buses, lots of trains embedded in buildings for some reason. It just provides that sense of sameness that I didn't make it as far as the jungle. But I can probably say that by that point, I feel like most people would have fallen off if they hadn't been grabbed already.
Yeah, I mean, and if you rented this game or if you just got it on GameFly for the time, then you had seen enough by this point where you said, okay, I mean, the swinging is kind of fun, but this is just not for me.
Right.
And so I think that also stresses the importance of a good first impression, don't you think, Rob?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because, to its benefit, the game does throw you into the gameplay fairly quickly, but, at first you don't have your arm, and so you're kind of running about without an arm. And, full disclosure, like, my grandfather was an amputee, so I'm really happy to see an amputee in a video game. That's pretty awesome, and I wish that the game had done more with that. Spaces where you're kind of, taking away your arm and you have to kind of figure things out that way, but that might have been a casualty of just not enough time and not enough budget. But then as soon as you get your arm, you're thrown into a tutorial and everything just grinds to a halt again. So I think that's very problematic. I mean, from a game design point of view, do you think that was the proper way to handle it, Rob?
Well, I have to say, I think to foreshadow a future conversation we're going to have about Dark Void, I think it actually does a better job than that game, at least in delivering like what you expect from the box, because yes, you do that thing where you run around and then you get the arm, but it doesn't take too long. At least I don't remember it taking too long, and then you are swinging away from that perspective, and so I think it does an okay job of getting you going, but the sparseness of the art, or the look, the brown look, is something that I wanted to talk about, because one thing, and I think I posted this on my Instagram when I was playing the game as well, there's a lot of stuff that I saw in like the way corridors were built and interiors were built where it would get very, very sparse. And I remember thinking, this would never fly now. This would absolutely never fly now. And I think it's games like this that really begin to just catapult the expense of game development, because art's really expensive. It's some of the most expensive marketing that there is, for games, and to have environment artists, and even with outsourcing and all the things people try to do to shortcut it. I mean, it's very expensive to build a game where every square inch of it looks amazing. And there's definitely lots of parts of Bionic Commando that look pretty basic in visuals, and pretty simplistic, which when you're used to playing games now, it's like it's very, very striking. But here's the thing, it's a lot cheaper to make things very basic. When you have that hallway that just has the potted plant in it, and a couple of crates, right, and that it's textured, and that's the hallway, right, that was sort of the last days, I think, where that was okay. And I think after games like this come out and they flop, and I couldn't believe the sales numbers I saw when I was looking at this. It was like 23,000 units or something like that in the first month or something like that, which is, wow, I mean, that's bad, right? I think the result of this is publishers were like, because the easiest thing for them to do is just look at it and go, we got to double down on visuals and art. And if you look at, you mentioned Uncharted 2, which is contemporary to this, and how much better it looked, and yeah, wow. I mean, it's quite striking, and it definitely kind of hurts the game, because gamers' expectations at this time were getting ramped up and up as well, I think.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
But, unfortunately, that's what we eventually got. And the reviews kind of bore out the fact that this was not a very well-received game. I mean, there were obviously some reviewers that saw a lot of positives in this game, but the criticism was mostly geared at the story, including the plot twist, which, as we have mentioned in this podcast before, it involves your dead wife being your bionic arm. So
that's amazing. I love it.
Ended up being very instantly meme worthy for everyone. But there was
that right there makes it like you should play.
Agreed.
Just
yes.
that moment.
And the game kind of hints at it, because at the beginning you put on your arm and you see your wife and you try to approach her and she just like runs away from you. So it kind of hints at the idea that your dead wife is in your arm, because supposedly that's the only way to fully sync up with your bionic arm. And so this was very deliberate on the part of the military.
Put your dead wife's soul juice all over your bionic arm, so it would make you the best bionic commando ever.
That sounds filthy, dude. That sounds absolutely filthy. But there was also criticism of the gritty look. I mean, no surprise there. And there was dissatisfaction with the gunplay and also the linearity of the game. But if there are positives, the swinging mechanics and also just the chaotic, madcap tactical sense of action that you had with the swinging, where you could approach, enemies from different ways, was actually praised. So there were enough positive reviews in there, and I think that the game is kind of getting, a reassessment nowadays. But as Rob mentioned, it was a commercial flop. There were only 27,000 copies sold in the US for the first month. When you compare that against the potential budget of this game, that is pretty terrible.
Yep.
And
What is that, like a 1% attach rate on Bionic Commando?
absolutely awful, regardless, particularly when you consider that it's on the 360 and the PS3 at the same time.
And the PS3,
Right.
yep.
And so Inafune, who was one of the executive producers on the game, was very quick to throw Grin under the bus, particularly for the plot twist of the wife's arm. And essentially what he said was, you eventually get to a point where you can't work with the team, and so you said, whatever, do what you want. Which, honestly, I think it speaks more about Inafune than anything else. The fact
That
that
doesn't sound like the Inafune that I know.
exactly. I mean,
How dare
if
you.
you're a producer and your reaction to not having a good working relationship with your developer is whatever, do what you want, then that just shows a failure from you as a leader. But then again, at the time, we didn't really know who Inafune really was.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, what's come out of this is that the relationship between Grin and Capcom was supremely strained. And so eventually things were released just because they had to be released rather than because anyone was really happy with how things worked out. But then again, I mean, I want to ask you guys, Jeff. I mean, Jeff, do you see a good game here? Or is this a game that was just flawed and it's interesting for how much potential it could have had? Where do you kind of fall on this?
Yeah, I fall with this game on a game that was clearly had its inspirations from the time. It was clearly trying to lean on some of the aspects that we were seeing a lot in gaming. We were talking about the radiation, which is basically making it a linear game, but it wants you to think it's open world, and that's an incredibly frustrating thing to show to the gamer. Hey, look what you can do, but we're not going to let you do it because we don't know how to get it to do that. So I mean, I don't want to pour scorn on developers. I've never developed a game myself, Rob. But I do think that it seems to promise some things. It seems maybe Dark Void, we're going to go into it a little bit more as well, but it seems like it is trying to copy some of the games of the time, and just doesn't hit the mark on any aspect. So for me to go back to it, I see on eBay it's like $3 or £4.
Yeah.
So it's like
I got mine for $1.
Exactly. So they only sold 30,000 copies, but you can pick it up for $1. It's like that's probably not a good sign for me to invest my time in.
Yeah, what do you think, Rob? You've had a lot more experience with the game, playing it, and have looked at it from a very analytical game design point of view.
Well, it's interesting, the reading about the development problems that you mentioned with Inafune and Capcom, and I'm thinking about my own experiences. And one thing I'll say to you and the audience is that for every game I've shipped, there's probably 2 or 3 canceled games in the pile, right? So I've had numerous projects that didn't make it, and when I think about those projects and they were with, this is where it's funny, I shouldn't care anymore. I'm at Purdue, I probably but I still have this NDA fear, so I'm going to be very vague.
Yeah.
But sure, have I worked with publishers from other cultures and time zones? Yeah, absolutely. And can that be sometimes a negative experience, or at least weird? Yeah, absolutely it can. And for various different reasons. I mean, I think what I've encountered is that there's probably different sort of thoughts about who's controlling the ideas, right? I think maybe in Japanese game development or publishing or whatever, there's maybe a little bit more likely to be an ideas person that is really running that show and may not let the developers respond organically to the game they're making. I mean, that's definitely a thing that can happen. And when those things build up over time, there does absolutely end up being a, just whatever attitude. Although what's interesting about the Inafune quotes that I read is that, he's kind of saying that they were the ones, at least implying that Grin were the ones that were kind of we're going to inflexibly stick to our ideas and do what we want. Now, who knows, right, if that was actually what happened. I guarantee they would have a different story. That's how it always is. But these things can be really difficult, and one of the worst feelings to have as a developer is knowing that you have virtually no control. I guess if that's one thing I wanted to say to the audience here, is that so often when a game doesn't hit the mark, the individual sort of blue-collar developer, if you will, that's there in the trenches probably has very little to do with the reasons why it didn't turn out the way everyone hoped. And it's a tough situation because you probably have months or maybe even years of work left on this thing, and you can just feel like here's a real example that I'm comfortable talking about directly. I'll mention Earth Defense Force. Like, we made the decision, and I'm very proud of that game. I'm very proud of the work Vicious Cycle did on it. But one thing that I disagreed with was we kind of did this Left 4 Dead style level structure where, like, levels were long. They were like 30 minutes plus, and that enabled us to make less levels. If you think about how the Sandlot developed EDF games are, they're done in these tiny chunks, where it's like some levels only take 5 minutes. And I think that's perfect for a game like that. There really isn't enough to sustain really long levels, so you want to get people in and out of them quickly. We decided, well, we're going to have like 15 levels that are long. And I just felt, at the time, and I was just a junior developer, I had no say whatsoever. I just felt, people are not going to like this as much, and I think that's one of the reasons why, although I think the game did well for our small budget and time and everything, that, I look back and go, yeah, the people that played the game generally don't like the fact their levels were long. And so there's so many things about a game that the developers end up having no control over, and probably both for Bionic Commando and Dark Void, there was probably a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. What are your final thoughts, Arnie?
I'd like to think that there's a good game buried in every game, but Bionic Commando is not that game for me. I honestly, I think there, obviously you could take like aspects of it and make them into a good game, but I don't necessarily think that there's like a quick fix to make this into a game that I'd really want to go back to. I do like some aspects of it. I do like, as much as I dislike the swinging, and that I didn't enjoy it in this game, I think that mechanic implemented into like a third-person shooter like that could be a ton of fun. Like, if you make it a lot snappier, if you make it a little bit faster, I think you could have a fun game with that concept. But, I think there's just a lot of issues, both right up front with the game and then behind the scenes in development that clearly, show that this was not getting off to the best start.
Yeah, I mean, and this is kind of my assessment of it. If you look at the other games that Grin released during that time, and that was Wanted, Weapons of Fate, which was a tie-in to the Wanted movie with James McAvoy, pretty forgotten by this point, and the other one was Terminator Salvation, which was a tie-in to Terminator Salvation. Those were also poorly received, and they did not become good sellers, and that was part of the reason why Grin went bankrupt. So yeah. I am willing, particularly considering the difficulties with Fortress and Square Enix, I am willing to give Capcom the benefit of the doubt here and say that Grin probably had a lot of the flaws here and a lot of the issues here in terms of making a good game. And, who knows exactly what happened. But certainly they were following along a certain design philosophy that was just not sitting well, apparently, with both gamers at the time and also the Japanese publishers that were basically funding this. Right. So I think this game is fascinating because it actually clearly does have a core here that you can kind of tap into. But as you say, Arnie, it might require so much tweaking and changing of the game that it would just be an entirely new thing in and of itself. So that's Bionic Commando for everyone. It didn't do well. If you find it for $3 or three quid, as Jeff would say, pick it up, see if you like the swinging mechanics. At the very least, you may get a few hours of enjoyment out of it. Or if you're Rob, you might get some ideas of what and what not to do in terms of game design.
Right.
So with that, let's take a quick break and jump back into Dark Void. Right, everybody, and we're back, and now we're going to talk about a game that Rob loves, and it's called Dark Void. Dark Void was developed by Airtight Games, and it was released shortly after Bionic Commando in January of 2010 for the PS3 and the Xbox 360, and I think a lot of people at the time played the demo, and the demo kind of presented very well because it was kind of in this semi-open area, and you had a jetpack, and you would go around shooting people and then flying on your jetpack, jumping on a UFO. It was just a very nice vertical slice of the game. And Dark Void is a third-person cover shooter, of which there were quite many at the time. So in that sense, it was still keeping within tradition and what was going on in 2009, 2010. But its main hooks were that you had this vertical cover shooting mechanic. Essentially, you could shoot from up, down, left, right, and take cover everywhere. And also the use of a hover pack and a jetpack, which we will discuss later. And Airtight Games is quite an interesting studio because they were founded by a ton of veterans from the industry. The core team itself was made up of the development team that did Crimson Skies, High Road to Revenge on the original Xbox. And if you remember, that game was kind of a fighter pilot kind of game in an alternate universe, in which you basically had dogfights in the air with these biplanes. And you can definitely see that lineage of Crimson Skies and Dark Void because they kind of share the same aesthetic influences. Do you see the similarities, Arnie? I mean, I know that you've played Dark Void on the original, Crimson Skies on the original Xbox. Do you kind of see the similarities between the two?
I could see the line being drawn. Obviously, like, I can see the similarities in the feel of the combat, you know, because you're obviously in the air and you sort of have that, like, more free-floating movement in terms of how you choose to approach fights and where you can go and what you can shoot and all that stuff. So I can definitely see, like, if you told me that Airtight made this and this, I'd be like, that makes sense. Like, I could see how they would make both of these things.
Yeah. And, you know, this game itself, I mean, it was the first game that Airtight Games published, and, you know, it brought people from FASA Studios, which was the one that developed Crimson Skies. Their lineage also traces back to MechWarrior, the MechWarrior franchise, and it also brought developers from Microsoft, and this includes Ed Fries, who was one of the most instrumental figures in getting the games lineup for the original Xbox. He was the vice president of game publishing for Microsoft. Unfortunately, the studio, like some of the studios that we've been talking about in this episode, was closed down in 2014. They then released a game called Murder Soul Suspect, which was a terrible flop for Square Enix, and for which the most important thing was that you could possess a cat, essentially, if I recall correctly. So the studio is no longer around, but their first game was Dark Void, and it's a game that takes influences from the action-adventure comics, books, and radio serials of the early 20th century. If you recall the movie The Rocketeer, it's very influenced by that.
Please don't remind me of that movie.
Oh, do you have a particular traumatic experience with The Rocketeer, Jeff?
It was just terrible. It was terrible, wasn't it? Or am I the only one? It was terrible.
I mean, it had Jennifer Connelly. I mean, there's just and jetpacks, and it had Timothy Dalton, the best James Bond there has been.
I'm not going to disagree with that.
Hard disagree.
So regardless of your thoughts on The Rocketeer, Dark Void certainly shared that same kind of influence, you know, with respect to its look. And it takes place in the 1930s, where you play as pilot William August Gray, and he's transported to an alternate universe via the Bermuda Triangle. And so the game has a kooky story where you get transported to this other world with reptilian creatures that are trying to help the Nazis essentially take over the world. It's
so actual history.
Yes. So they're actually trying to just let history play out as it did.
It's a documentary.
The alternate universe is our real universe.
Perhaps. And so it's, Nikola Tesla gets involved. This is one of 1,000 games in which Nikola Tesla shows up to be amazing. And the funny thing about Nikola Tesla in this game is that it's actually voiced by the Colonel from Metal Gear Solid. Oh, wow. I don't know if any of you guys got that, but I was like, oh, I remember that voice.
Oh, wow, nice.
And I was like trying to put my finger on it, but it has like a weird accent, and I was like, oh my god, it's the Coronel.
Yeah.
So
it's always funny looking back on games of this specific time period, because it really seemed for a while there like the formula was make a shooter and add a weird gimmick to it. Like, those are the two things. You throw them in the pot and see what comes out. And this is one of the more entertaining gimmicks, I think.
Listen, you throw a jetpack into anything and you will have my attention at the very least. And I think this game had the right idea. And I think if they had more time to probably develop those ideas and probably develop a longer game and more expensive game, I think this would be a very well-remembered game, I think. But the game also had something that was very prevalent around 2009, and that was Nolan North. Nolan North actually voiced the main character, and this was one of the games, just like with the 2008 Prince of Persia, that people heard Nolan North and they were like, why is Nathan Drake on this game? And why is Nathan Drake in every game? Even though that wasn't the case, but hey, people's perception was that Nolan North was in every game. And this was another one of the factors that did not play in favor of Dark Void. But Rob, I want to hear from you. I know you've played this game a little bit, and you have thoughts, and I want to hear those thoughts.
Right. So, when you talk about the ingredients here, jetpack stuff, I love flying games. Like, I love the Ace Combat games. I grew up playing, TIE Fighter and X-Wing and all that. When you talk about the sort of pedigree of the studio, the kind of bonkers storyline, there's all these ingredients I should absolutely love. And in a way, I think that's why I raged a little bit at this one. And I remember at the time when the game came out, I can't remember if I bought it or rented it, but I got it. And the thing the game does right away that just immediately is like a punch to the face as a gamer is you start out in a really cool little sequence. You're flying with the jetpack right away. You're like flying around, shooting ships, and you're like, this is great. Yeah, give more. This is what I want. And then you're on the ground in cover for a long time. And I just gave up on it back when it came out. I was just so pissed off at it. And I got to experience that all over again, getting ready for this podcast. I'm like, maybe I'll be more forgiving now. I'm older, wiser, or whatever. I fired up and I'm like, yeah, this is great. Oh, right. I'm going to do this for a while. And, to be fair, they bring you back into the jetpack and stuff, and it becomes part of the game.
Yeah.
But it does seem bizarrely, I think, schizophrenic in terms of what it wants to be. And I think it's just such a shame because it has so much potential.
Yeah, like I mentioned, I think this is probably one of those games that was released at the tail end of Capcom basically writing checks to third-party developers to just do something.
Right.
And that probably resulted in a game that was cut down in scope, more than they probably wanted. It's a very short game. It's about 6 hours long. And at some point, you basically just get split from the jetpack sections to the cover sections, and it just makes for a game that feels like it wanted to do much more. But Jeff, what are your thoughts on Dark Void? What is your first impression? What is your last impression? What do you think?
Yeah, my first impressions when I was watching some of the old reviews and the videos online was here we go again. Another game that I would have just blased over back in 2010 when I had Uncharted 2 sat on my shelf. I think it's really funny to see Nolan North. It kind of reminds me of David Hayter when he pops up in things and you go, why Snake in the Guyver? I was like, oh yeah, David Hayter has a career outside of being being Snake. So
it really is the curse of being in a game that's that successful.
Yeah.
Well, it's resulted.
Now you're that guy forever.
It's resulted in Nolan North essentially having to switch up his voice for different games. I mean, he was the Penguin in Batman Arkham City.
Was he?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah. So he's just kind of completely switched it up. He was also the creepy character in The Last of Us, the cannibal. And again, that's one of those things that you wouldn't imagine that being Nolan North.
He was the gunship pilot in Earth Defense Force Insect Armageddon for like a tiny
really?
little role. Yeah, he was. It had a Texas accent and everything. He was great.
Wow.
Yeah, he's a very versatile guy. I really appreciate him as a voice actor. So it's really unfortunate that he got kind of shoehorned into that Nathan Drake role, even though it brought him so much acclaim.
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully there's another Uncharted so that he can keep getting paychecks, but
Exactly.
I'm sure that he's not starving for voice gigs.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah.
I think Nathan Drake has done a lot of good for his life. I'm sure.
Yeah. I mean, and look, at the end of the day, I mean, I look at Dark Void, and it's a game that I really want to love. It's a game that I look at it and I say, this is exactly what I want, in a game. Just pure, no holds barred fun, going around from place to place, jumping on a UFO, and going around in my with my jetpack. If you look at Crimson Skies, you can definitely see that idea of free flying and dogfights and the like. It's definitely there, and I wish that the game had done more with that. But again, I feel like it was a game that was just sent out to die in a way. But let's talk a little bit about what the game brings to the table. I mean, it brings this vertical cover shooting, and so every platform in every direction can be used as a cover. From a game design point of view, Rob, what do you think about this idea?
Well, on paper and even in execution at times, I think it's really cool. I've worked on cover shooters in my career before, and generally the Bible that everyone follows for cover shooters. This was really done developed in a Epic Games Gears of War postmortem, I think they published, and everyone kind of goes by this, where they say, okay, in a cover shooter, it is like Mario, except instead of platforms you're jumping up and down to, you're like going across the cover. You have to think of it that way, and that's kind of what everyone tries to do. It's like, oh, it's a platformer, but you're just, instead of jumping up, you're going from each cover point. And so any way you can break up the kind of potential monotony that design can cause is really good. And of course, there's some really successful moments where, especially when you peer down, when you're kind of going up and down in cover, and you're actually just jumping from cover piece to cover piece, that feels real good. And I felt like there might have been a game there that could have just been based on those cover mechanics, just like there might have been a separate game just based on the jetpack flying, even though they tried to kind of connect those two things because you use the jetpack to get into cover and all that. So there's some design ideas in here that are actually of I think, great merit, and that can be utilized in other games, successfully. But it's really just the stew here, the recipe, the meal that you get is discordant at the end of the day, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and it's one of the most, I think, disheartening and disappointing games in that you don't really get the full meal that you keep expecting. It's almost like, you see that dessert that is so sumptuous and it looks great, and then it turns out that when you eat into it, they actually put salt into it, or
Right.
I don't know, they threw in radishes out of nowhere because they wanted to be experimental.
Right.
The radishes are undercooked. So I don't know where I'm going with this analogy, but at the same time, I'm going to stick with it.
It's making me hungry right here.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's that too. But, it also has the hover pack, and I actually really enjoy this because it creates a different kind of platforming. I don't know, I mean, I'm not that bothered with what the game brought to the table, even if it could have been so much more. The idea of going from ledge to ledge, even if you're in this jungle environment, is kind of really, is to my liking. But I think the problem is the repetition of it all.
Yes.
I think that the game never really moves away from that feedback loop of just you jump from place to place and then more enemies come out. You take your guns, you keep going, and then you jump a few more places and then more enemies come out. That, I think, ultimately is the problem, not just with Dark Void, but just every cover shooter of the times. That's the reason why, to me, Gears of War is a wholly unenjoyable experience. I mean, I can play it for an hour, but at the end of the day, I'm still getting the same loop over and over again. There's a feeling of I want to break out, I want to talk to the characters, I want to I don't know, have a branching dialogue or something like that. I want to have something that gives me more variety other than just, well, now you get to shoot people in a car. And I don't think that this game did enough to differentiate itself from that. Do you think that that's a fair assessment, Arnie?
I think so. I will say, like, unlike Bionic Commando and like you guys have been saying, there is enough here that with even slight alterations and slight quality of life modifications, this could have been a much better game. And it could have been, I think, much more well received. So I think the skeleton of a good game is there.
Yeah, but paradoxically, I mean, this game received lower scores than Bionic Commando. There was too much of a Me Too feel to the game. But, many reviewers pointed out that there was some mad potential in the game. And again, like I said, I think that people were just burned out with cover shooters. They were burned out with Nolan North. And it was just like, it just came out at the wrong time. And the fact that the game failed to live up to its promise did not help it. So, Rob, do you think that criticism at the time was fair? Or do you think that this game deserves a reassessment?
No, I think it's quite fair. I mean, I do also agree. It's kind of interesting. I feel like Bionic Commando was maybe, as we sit and talk about it, a better execution of a weaker underlying design, whereas like Dark Void is a weaker execution of a better underlying design, perhaps, at least as I look at it. But because there is one thing I noted, and I didn't really note this when I played Bionic Commando, there are some kind of what I would consider some level design flubs that would seem reasonably obvious. Like there are several situations where I would open a door and enemies would pour out and shoot me right in the face, right? You have no time to react. And that's just like a huge no-no. There are certainly some boss fights. I think it's called the Archon, the kind of walker that's trying to blow up the ship that's escaping, where, you're given very unclear directions. And so I'm blowing up the legs. Okay, great. Then what do I do now? And I have, very little idea. And eventually I figure out, right, it's that orange kind of hard to see thing I have to now hit. But by the time I figure it out, the time's out, time runs out, and then the ship you're supposed to protect gets blown up, and you get like super mad when that kind of stuff happens. So I feel like that concept I brought up earlier about service to the player, that is, I think, something Japanese games do very well by and large, is kind of missing here, where they're not hitting those tiny details that, maybe you don't notice it, maybe it just annoys you, but you don't know why. And I think that kind of stuff happens a lot, actually, in Dark Void. Quality of life things. Like I got myself in a weird state where I was falling, and because of the jetpack, I was able to not completely fall, but I couldn't rise up to where I needed to go because they hadn't given you the flying ability yet to save myself. So I was just stuck, and I had to just die on purpose, right? I mean, that's kind of weird. So
yeah, that's definitely not what you're supposed to be doing in a game.
Right.
If that happens, then either it's a glitch or your design failed, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. Here's my pitch. We get all the boys back together, get the whole crew back, right? We turn the main guy, into Boba Fett, and you make Star Wars Bounty Hunter 2.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Make me happy.
That's a great idea.
Or an adaptation of The Mandalorian, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah.
To go along with Season 2. That's exactly what we need. Disney, get on it. So with that, let's actually jump on to the next one, which is going to be a much more positive assessment and a much more positive game, and that's going to be Dragon's Dogma. So we'll be back. Right, everybody, and we are back, and we're going to round out this discussion on some of the Capcom games that came out in the 7th generation, and now we're going to be talking about a game that both Rob and I have a lot of love for. We have all the time in the world for this game, and certainly, based on our understanding, a lot of other people do as well. It's kind of a cult hit, and this is Dragon's Dogma, not to be confused with Dragon's Crown. Dragon's Dogma, which is Capcom's take on Western RPGs. And this game was actually internally developed by Capcom and released on the PS3 and the Xbox 360 in May of 2012. But unlike the other two games we talked about, this one was internally developed. And you can definitely see that the return on investment for Capcom was better, with an internally developed game. It seemed like this was Japan actually starting to come to terms with the HD generation, and certainly it was a massive undertaking for Capcom. From what I have seen, it took a lot of work to get this done, and it took a lot of development manpower in order to get this up and running. And even then, the game was in a very rough state for a long time. But thankfully, Capcom had a very good man at the helm, and that was director Hideaki Itsuno, who is a Capcom veteran. He has previously directed Power Stone, and also Devil May Cry 2 to 4, and most recently Devil May Cry 5, which was a great return to form for the series. And you can definitely see the sprinkling of Itsuno's very different experience in many genres in this game, because it feels like it takes from his action background, it also takes from his world building, and I think the game has a very interesting take on the Western RPG. Interestingly enough, the game was actually designed back in 2000. Itsuno actually had the design documents for this back in the year 2000 before he started work on Devil May Cry 2, but it wasn't until 2008 that Capcom basically gave the green light to this game. And it was pretty much developed by the same team that released Devil May Cry 4, which came out in 2008. So you can definitely see that the team went from working on Dante's adventure to basically going to medieval fantasy. So let me ask you, Rob, what was your first experience with this game?
Yeah, so as you hinted at before, I mean, I absolutely adore this game. It's one of my all-time favorites, probably maybe even in my personal top 10 somewhere. And so my first exposure to this game was actually when I was working on BioShock. I was living in Boston at the time, and one of the weird things about that is, I am a family man, as it were, but because of the circumstances of that adventure, I was living in a paid-for corporate apartment in Boston. And my family was still in Madison, Wisconsin. I would visit once a month and all that. And so I had a lot of time on my hands after work, right? And so one of the things I did is I went out and got Dragon's Dogma, because that was in the summer of 2012, right, when that game was released. And first of all, let me just say, because this is lost to the ether now, all the new versions of it that have been ported do not have this. The first version of that game had the most incredible theme song at the beginning. It was this Japanese metal sort of anthem by this group.
J-pop.
Yeah, by this group called Bees, B''Z. And sometimes, anyone that follows my Instagram knows I'm a guitar player or whatever. I had like a guitar I had rented from some shop so I can keep playing in my apartment. And I would just jam to that and sometimes forget to play the game. I like that song so much. Into Free, I think it's called. But anyway, man, it made a great impression because it kind of scratched a lot of kind of itches that I had to kind of combine what I liked about playing like an Elder Scrolls game or something like that, but things that I liked from Final Fantasy. It finally seemed like, wow, someone has combined those worlds together. The dynamic combat was so cool. The game score was great. I loved what they did with the kind of circular story. It kind of folds back on itself in an interesting way. Just a really special game, and I feel like it's good that we're capping our kind of themed podcast with this, because this is like, okay, they've learned now. If Bionic Commando and Dark Void was the Japanese industry being like, we need to appeal to the West, but maybe they didn't quite do it exactly right or whatever, this is the Goldilocks zone of that, where it's definitely a Japanese game. It has that stuff I like about Japanese game design, but there's, in the open world, elements of it and the action elements of it. It appeals, I think, to a Western audience, and I think it's why it's become this cult hit.
Yeah, absolutely. And my experience with it was basically that I think Sony gave it away as part of the PlayStation Plus program. And, at that time, I was just playing whatever came out during, that program. And I played it having no expectations because I have distinct memories of when the game was first shown, I think in 2011, that the game looked pretty janky. And that people looked at it, and Capcom spent most of the time in the presentation discussing the character design tool. And people were just making fun of this. And that impression just kind of stuck with me. So when I actually played it, I had already played Dark Souls 2 at the time, and so I was kind of looking for something that scratched that itch. And I'm not going to say this game is Dark Souls. It's definitely not like that. If anything, it's more Monster Hunter in nature.
Yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, it does have that kind of dark fantasy look that is really appealing to me. And when I played it, I was just completely surprised and blown away by what I got. I mean, the game has, particularly when you play it on the PS3 and the 360, it has a lot of technical issues. It's not a looker. If you play it on the remastered version in PS4 and Xbox One, it's definitely the way to go, or on PC. But certainly, I had tons of fun with the game, and the fact that the game just did not play, it was brutal. It's one of those games that just, if you don't come at it the right way, if you don't, prepare for a journey, you will die. And I found that very appealing because it really brought with it a sense of adventuring that is kind of lost in other games because you're just kind of being led down a hallway, essentially. With this game, you actually had to plan your journey, which I think more games now are doing that, with Breath of the Wild and Death Stranding kind of making the entire experience around that. But with Dragon's Dogma, they really achieved that, and the feeling of danger, when night comes and you're adventuring out and everything just becomes more dangerous, it just really does turn into kind of survival horror at that point. And I just found that to be so absolutely fascinating. But I want to ask you, Arnie, and Geoff, did you have any experience playing this game?
I started playing it 2 days ago.
Okay, well, at least you did.
It was such an interesting thing because I sort of had like a similar path to yours. I remember seeing this in like GameStop and stuff when it came out, and honestly, the thing I remember thinking was that I hated the cover of it. I was like, this game looks kind of bog standard, like sort of like you said, medieval fantasy. Like, I'm not really interested. I kept putting it off. And then eventually I bought it for like, I don't know, $10 when I had heard people starting to say good things about it, like years later. But I'd never sat down and played it. And I'll say when I booted it up, I'm so glad that you said that that people thought it was ugly, because I wasn't sure if that was going to be a controversial statement. But when I started playing this, I was like, this game looks horrendous.
I mean, from what perspective though? From an aesthetic perspective?
Yeah, like it's specifically the like the environments and stuff I think are okay, but when I saw my character, like because there's like a little prologue sequence that was fine, but then when I see my character in like the village, I'm like, this guy looks like a potato. Like, what is happening? But then once I got into the actual gameplay, I was immediately hooked. This is the one of the three that I'm like, I'm going to keep playing this and I want to finish it. It's been very enjoyable. I haven't been able to dig into it as much as I wanted to. And I will say the comparison to Monster Hunter is sort of apt. And you know how I feel about Monster Hunter. Like, I could not get into Monster Hunter at all.
I know, but it's not Monster Hunter. I mean, it's not as segmented as Monster Hunter. There's a lot of similarities in the hack and slash elements, but at the same time, the game gives you enough variety where you don't have to play it that way.
Yep, and the climbing big monsters, in my opinion, is a lot easier. It feels a lot more satisfying. Yep. The pawn system, which I did not think that was going to work out well. So far, I've had no issues with it. I really enjoy that the AI sort of has its autonomy, but doesn't, at least as of right now, has not done anything incredibly rock stupid.
Yeah, and let me ask you, are you playing it on the PS3 or are you playing it on
Yes, on the PS3.
Why would you do this, man? I mean, that's why it's ugly.
It's the version I owned. But
I guess it's to be expected from Arnie.
Yeah,
You would go
But
with the cheapest one.
Now I am truly the thing that really turned me back onto it was when I saw that Dark Arisen came out on the PS4, and I was so confused by that because I was like, I thought this game was bad. Like, I thought nobody played this. So when I saw that it had a sequel, I started looking into it, and I was like, oh no, this seems like it's actually
It's not a sequel, it's an
fun.
expansion. But
An expansion, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. What about you, Jeff?
Yeah, so this game falls right. I checked the date that it came out. This game falls right when I didn't even have a device that could connect to the internet. I was backpacking around Australia for about 10 months. I think I was cycling with a one-man tent at the time, so like I was completely oblivious to anything that was happening. And so when you mentioned this game, my first thought was, oh, another game with dragon in the title. Okay. Which one is this that I've missed? And it's one that I hadn't come across. And looking at the videos and then looking at, it didn't look great, the original PS3 stuff, but you kind of put it down to, hey, look, PS3, it's a generation ago. I'm not going to hold aesthetics against it. But I mentioned it to a couple other people that I talked to with video games, and they're like, oh yeah, that's a really interesting game. It's well worth trying. So I've put it on my radar on my PS4 for the extra game. So when that goes on sale, I'll probably pick it up. Because it does seem really interesting. I do like my Western RPGs somewhat. I always preferred the slight Japanese kind of take on RPGs. Like Skyrim, I really struggled to get on with. Monster Hunter, I did get on with to a point. And yeah, it seems like something when you guys have spoken about it so far, but also looking through the reviews that came out at the time, it seems to be something that I think I could get my teeth stuck into.
Yeah, I think you should definitely give it a try. I mean, at the very least, you might find yourself pleasantly surprised by it. And in terms of like the generic kind of fantasy nature of it, it is kind of generic because it's kind of taking the same tropes that you have seen time and again, but at the same time, it's interpreted by the Japanese, and it sort of kind of amalgamates a ton of different influences. So that like there's like Greek mythology and medieval European, kind of influences. It's all just kind of thrown together into a hodgepodge. And it almost feels like, let's say, an American developer kind of making a samurai game with like Chinese characters or like, I don't know, I mean, like Journey to the West or something like that. It's like, well, it's all like generally Asian, so let's just throw it in there. With this game, it's almost like the same thing. It's like it's vaguely European or vaguely Western, so let's just throw it all in there. But the big thing about it is it's kind of climbable, mechanics, in which it takes its influence, I think, very strongly from Shadow of the Colossus, in which you can actually climb the monsters that you're fighting and the bosses. How do you feel about this feature, Rob?
Well, obviously, it's one of the huge like kind of tent poles the game is built around. I remember the first time I was able to figure out that you can actually, I think you can either have the pawns throw you, or you can throw the pawns in the air in order to get onto the back of one of the larger monsters, and how just amazingly cool that is. And just kind of being blown away by it. And it adds such a fun dimension to these fights because, usually when you have, and even Monster Hunter, and I actually love the Monster Hunter games, but there's this element of, these are bags of hit points, right? And you're just kind of wailing on them, and whatever you can do in a game design to obscure that fact and make the combat seem a little more dynamic, and you're not just making a life bar go down, is always going to, I think, sit well with me. And so that element of the game, I think, was extraordinarily successful. I think One aspect that I didn't see in the show notes, and I don't hear people talk about a lot, so I'll force feed it in now, is this game has a really fascinating romance mechanic that is not apparent. That's what makes it fascinating, because they don't spell it out. They don't even tell you about it. Basically, there's a bunch of different characters that you can interact with, and it's all of them, I believe. It's like right down to like the shopkeeper guy. And you can give gifts to characters, and there's no bar that fills up. I think there's a little chime that plays when you do something, and that's it. And so I don't want to spoil the story, but there's a big story implication that's based on this. And if you're not aware of it, and probably 60%, 70% of the players weren't aware of it, you'll be shocked at how that turns out at the end of the game for you, depending on like who you were interacting with the most. And I actually really like that part of the game.
Yeah, and I think that's part of like the Japanese, design principles seeping in. I mean, this is not something that you would necessarily see from a Western developer. It's just like, well, let's just throw a romance element here and you can romance everybody.
Right, yes.
So that to me is completely fascinating, and I don't think, let's say, if Grin was in charge of developing this game, they probably wouldn't have had that because it would have been too cute. So I think that really kind of demonstrates the different design philosophies. Rob, maybe you can explain the story for us, since it's a little bit nutty.
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, it's basically the situation where you get your heart ripped out, like not metaphorically or allegorically. It's actually ripped out of you by the dragon that's part of the title early on in the game, and it sets up this really fascinating mythology where there are these characters where this is a cyclical thing. This whole story is based on a cycle of almost kind of like, I guess, reincarnation or whatever, where like these they're called arisens. These people that have the dragon comes, they choose you, your heart's ripped out, and then everything kind of drives towards a potential final confrontation with this dragon. And it's clear that the world kind of cycles through these things, and so you're kind of playing a role in that as an arisen. And the whole game drives towards like the choices that you make, and they do give you a choice in how you handle that end scenario, which I find really interesting how they handled that, because there's big implications there.
And I imagine that you completed the game, right?
I did. In fact, I played through it a couple times, actually. It's one of those games for me that,
And were you satisfied with the conclusion of the story? Did you feel like that was a positive or a negative for the game?
It's interesting. I feel like there was this element of like there was a little bit of like just trying to figure it out, because it is a little odd, right? And so I was kind of scratching my head, I think, with how the game ended. But then I had this is something I really like about game stories, I think, or really any story in any media, where if you find yourself thinking about it a whole lot after you've played it, it means it's been successful. And this does, because I'm thinking, well, wait, I'm kind of connecting the dots. That character was one that made this different choice, and that's why they're in that situation. And then there's, the king and the choice the king made, and he's in that situation. And then you run to YouTube and be like, well, what if I played the game this way instead? And like, yeah, it's one of those where you have, I mean, if we talk about something like Mass Effect 3 that tried a multiple ending thing and it made people mad and everything, this is a situation where I think the multiple endings actually work out quite well, all in all, even if it does make you scratch your head a little bit.
Yeah.
I will say one of the things that I did enjoy that Rob pointed out was the fact that this is sort of the story that you're playing is a cycle, so it's not the first time this has happened.
Right.
And I like that idea of you're not the chosen one, you're one of a line of chosen ones.
Yes.
And nobody really seems to care. At least as far as I've gotten, like it's like, oh, you're an arisen. Cool. And it's like there's no like, oh, here he is, you gotta go on the grand quest, blah, blah, blah. It's just like, oh, you're another one of those guys.
Right.
Have fun.
Hope you don't die.
I really like that.
What do you think about the pawn system, Rob?
So the one thing I will say that no one's brought up yet is they do talk a lot, and actually that is a source.
It's very repetitive.
It's a source of great entertainment.
They do not shut up.
They try to help you. It's meant to be help, but like you'll hear things like, they're weak to fire and ice both, or whatever, and you hear these things over and over again. I think you can. There are ways to toggle that a little bit in the game, but in general, they're just going to be very chatty, and they're going to say the same kind of helper lines constantly. And I found it amusing. It was kind of one of those things where maybe it's not the best, but you just laugh at it. But as far as the utility of the pawns, I think one of the other panelists talked about this earlier. I do like the variety it introduces the game, and the fact that you can swap them out at regular intervals. So if you're like, okay, I want more magic in my party, you can find a pawn that has that ability, or I want it to be a melee based team, or I want one to be an archer. It just creates this really cool sort of customizable kind of party system that is actually quite fun and engaging.
Yeah, and beyond that, we should mention that you could actually share your pawns online, so that other players could use your pawns, and you could use the pawns from other players. And so that creates kind of a shared world in which it's not multiplayer, but you're kind of seeing how people develop their pawns, and it just adds some more variety to it. So that kind of asymmetrical online component was very interesting for the time, during a period in which developers were trying to do this kind of asymmetry that was popularized by Demon's Souls and Dark Souls.
Right.
So I found it interesting. I thought that the pawn system was good. I do think that it was quite annoying to hear them repeat the same lines over and over again, and it just kind of inevitably happens. But I thought that it was a good way forward. It kind of feels like on paper it's just like, oh well, yes, it's just like you have partners, like, period. But no, it's actually a little bit more than that. They're kind of like your squires in a way, and they kind of help you throughout the journey. So in that sense, it feels like you do actually have companions on your journey that are fully customizable, by you. So I actually really enjoyed it. So I guess at the end of the day, what makes this game special for you, Rob?
So this game is one of those things that I like to bring up if I'm like giving some lecture on world design, and the reason why I bring it up is because it does something that I actually don't like jargon, but I'll go ahead and indulge myself and use a jargon word here, verisimilitude, just the realness of the world. It's very logical, and for instance, if you think about the way it's structured, you have like several towns. You have kind of like the big main town and a few other smaller things. They're all connected by that main road. And on the road, you are generally, not always, but generally safer than when you're not on the road. And that's a rule that you learn right away. It's logical. It makes perfect sense. There's NPCs on that road. They're all capable of engaging in combat. When you get into a fight, they'll fight with you. So you learn right away that there's this rule that if I want to fight more dangerous stuff, I'm going to go into the wilderness. And that goes into planning that you brought up before, Ozzy. And I think the game does a great job of that, making you plan your journey, because invariably you're going to have to go off the road to find a place that you need to find. And you just know, well, if I have to go walk in the forest somewhere, I'm in more danger. There's going to be stronger enemies and more enemies, to speak nothing of the day-night cycle. And so I just love that, because it's not like when you look at the Elder Scrolls games, there's a lot of effort made. The NPCs are programmed to like have routines and jobs, and I don't get the sense that Dragon's Dogma had that level of sophistication with their NPCs, but they didn't need it, because just watching people on the road delivering goods on their back and guards walking, soldiers walking on that road, it just creates this illusion of a functioning society. Like, hey, this is an actual world I'm living in where people are walking from town to town. And it also makes kind of the semi-procedural events of the game more effective, because occasionally you'll leave town and you'll start walking on the road and there'll be some big pitched battle going on, and that's not the norm. And because it's not the norm, it really stands out as, your adrenaline gets pumping.
Yeah, I think that's also similar to why I feel the game is special. It does have a sense of cohesion that you don't necessarily see in a lot of open worlds, and Like you said, it does feel like a lived-in world, and it's not the greatest open world game. There are certainly larger open world games, but for what it does, it's a very self-contained slice of this world that fits. And even adventuring out into the dungeons feels like a risky endeavor, and the dungeons do feel like they have that sense of age and time. And threat, quite frankly. I mean, it's one of the few games where I feel it does darkness really well, in that it's actually complete pitch black darkness. Yep. And if you run out of oil, then you are stuck.
Yes.
It's absolutely terrifying to be out in the dark in this game. And so I feel like it's a game that I think, with the benefit of a sequel, it could really do so many great things. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, the game was very well received. It wasn't like, nines across the board or anything, but I think enough reviewers saw how enjoyable the game was and how good of an achievement this was for Capcom, particularly since no one trusted Capcom to develop a game like this.
Right.
And so it's become a cult hit, and there has been talk about a sequel. Certainly Itsuno, who basically has a lot of leeway now with Capcom because he got Devil May Cry 5 across the door, and that was a very good seller for Capcom. He's expressed interest in a new one, and Netflix has actually just started working on an animated series, so there's definitely a lot of life left in Dragon's Dogma. But where do you kind of see Dragon's Dogma going? Arnie, let me start off with you.
I think the where it's going now is where it needs to go, right? I think that a sequel would do well. If not only for the fact that it would also bring in new people who can then go back and play Dark Arisen as well, get their fix that way. Like, I think there's a lot of meat on this bone for Capcom to explore. And I think so long as they don't, do something incredibly stupid and, change everything, I think that this is a type of game that a lot of people can get behind.
Geoff, what do you think? I mean, I know you haven't played the game, but just from the outside looking in, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, looking at where Capcom are today, when you see the popularity that they're going to go through again, a bit of a change in good fortune. Maybe it's a coincidence that it's tied in with their older franchises, but it feels like a good moment for Capcom to strike whilst the iron's hot for them. Go for something that is a known quantity, is in-house. It's got, obviously, somebody at Netflix obviously likes it. Didn't realise there was going to be an animated series. But it does feel like this is a good time for Capcom to kind of push something that they believe in quite heavily compared to maybe what the public originally felt. And they can make something of it.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I think if Capcom can perhaps throw in a little bit of Ghosts and Goblins into it, and maybe add Arthur into it.
Interesting.
Maybe make it a crossover, and add Firebrand or something as one of the enemies. Who knows? I mean, they could do crazy things with it. But Rob, what do you see and what do you want out of a sequel from Dragon's Dogma?
Oh, wow. So, I certainly hope and would be a little surprised, honestly, if it didn't happen. Only because when you look at the history of the game being ported, it's now been ported to everything. You can play it on a toaster now, because it's now on Switch, it's on PS4, it's on PC. I remember when it came out on Steam, Capcom said it was like, at that time, their fastest selling PC release they ever came out with. So clearly the word of mouth has spread on this. It's no longer a secret, so it would be, totally behoove them to make a sequel, and they probably are. Because, they love being able to look at past performance, so I would be shocked if they weren't. As far as what I would like to see, there is this temptation when you make a sequel based on success, where you can kind of throw the kitchen sink at everything, and it becomes too much. So hopefully they won't do that. Hopefully they'll iterate sort of sensibly on a really good base that they have, and not go, crazy. There is kind of a weird sweet spot there. Where you make something better, but if you go too hard, then all of a sudden you have too many ingredients and you don't get that nice meal, to use that analogy. So yeah, I think, when you look at the improvements of their technology, you look at something like the Resident Evil 2 remake and how great that looked on PS4. I think they have the technical chops to make something that looks a little more appealing, because, listening to you all talk about this, I guess I didn't realize at the time there was such a strong reaction to the game's visuals. So, doctoring that up would be something that's important, but then keep all the elements of the game that made it unique and interesting with the combat, and maybe make the pawns, still keep the pawns, maybe not have them tell you that this creature is weak to fire so often.
Exactly. I mean, and it will be a great way to test the Resident Evil engine, to see if it can handle something this large and open world, because it's shown itself to be flexible quite a bit. It's gone from first person to third person. So that's what Capcom is using now, but also Capcom is not shy anymore about using something like the Unreal Engine.
Right.
So I think the fact that Capcom is going to be able to use a different engine than the MT Framework engine, which was quite limited in its technical capabilities, I think it's going to help them develop a better product. It's possibly going to be a few years out before we see any sequel, because it just, a game like this takes time.
Right.
But certainly I kind of agree with you, Rob, that this is sort of an inevitability, and we're all the better for it, because I think this is a really fantastic potential franchise for Capcom. So if you get anything from this episode, play Dragon's Dogma.
Yes.
Maybe try out the other two, but Dragon's Dogma is definitely the one that you want to play.
Yes.
And so that rounds it up. That is the entirety of our episode. Maybe we'll look back at a few more Capcom titles from this generation, or maybe we'll jump over to Konami or Namco or other publishers that were really struggling during this time. But for now, this has been it. Rob, where can we find you?
All right, so yeah, you can find me on Twitter, Rojo Games there. You can find me on Instagram, also Rojo Games. It might be Rojo Games 80, perhaps. I can't quite remember, but Rojo Games something. Rojo Games on Facebook. I think just my mom and maybe like a cat is on that. Not that many followers on Facebook. But yeah, also, as been mentioned a few times, I do have a podcast of my own, Grid Snaps podcast, on all the things that you get podcasts from. So if you want to hear my hopefully healing baritone voice again, that's one place that you can check me out. So.
Certainly. And we are the Region Free Gamers podcast. And if you want to find us, you can find us on Instagram, where we go by Region Free Gamers podcast. And Arnie is usually there handling the Instagram duties. So you can talk to us there. But you can also find us on our website, regionfreegamers.com, and also on Twitter, at Region Free Gamer without an S, because Twitter is like that. And this has been super fun. Rob, thank you so much for joining us on this episode.
Thank you so much, Rob.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's
Thank
great.
you.
So much fun.
And we hope to have you back, hopefully discussing some other elements of game design that we didn't get to talk about this time.
Yeah, it'd be my pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And until next time, see you around.